Welcome to the closing session for this year's Krost Symposium. Dr. Jennifer Motz is going to just introduce next year's topic, and then I'll have a quick moment before we bring up the panel.
Good afternoon. Hi, how are you? As Dr. Bailey mentioned, my name is Dr. Jennifer Mata. I am the chair of next year's Krost Symposium. Next year's Krost Symposium is entitled Stopping Gender-Based Violence. It will take place on October 23rd and 24th. Our keynote speaker will be Dr. Jackson Katz. So if you know of Dr. Katz's work, he's done a lot around media and violence and men and masculinity. So we're looking forward to that. Also tentatively on our schedule are a series of community panelists, a scholar, Brittany Chazinski, and Las Mamis of Myth and Bullshit, Mala Munoz and Diosa Fem, who are two Latina podcast creators coming out of LA who talk about gender-based violence in Latinx communities. So I welcome you to that next fall. Thank you.
So now I'll welcome up our panelists and our moderator. We have a team of veterinarians who really run a range of experiences from small animal practice kind of things to wildlife to disaster relief to all kinds of species. We got a whole lot going on. And just one more thanks to Merck Animal Welfare for helping make all of this possible. Come on up, y'all. So in order as they arrive, I'll see if I can figure out how they're going to arrive. It looks like in tandem. It looks like Dr. Lisa Stalvis, Dr. Valerie Tynes, Dr. Jay Tischendorf, our Merck rep, and Dr. Logan Bean.
All right. Yes. We'll get this, we'll kick this pig into gear a little bit. Hi, I'm Logan Bean, and I'm probably the least intelligent person up here. That's why Scott put me in charge as the moderator. The moderator usually introduces everybody and then steps out of the way and just watches the show. Today I'll be kind of helping direct traffic. I'll be kind of like the intellectual bouncer, so to speak. So any questions you have, direct it up here, and I'll kind of share evenly with everyone out there. First, I'd like to introduce them all, though, because they're really, I'm kind of the jester of the group. Valerie Tynes, here to my left, the far left there, Dr. Tynes. She's a native Texan, received her DVM from Texas A&M University, Agam Giggies. She worked in private practice for 14 years before returning to academia to pursue a residency in clinical animal behavior at UC Davis in 2000. She's been a diplomate of the American College of Veterinary Behavioralists since 2003 and is currently the immediate past president of the college. She's also board certified in animal welfare. Her special interest is the behavior and welfare of pet pigs, exotic pets, and zoo animals. She's a frequent speaker at veterinary meetings such as this. She joined SEVA in October of 2014. SEVA is one of the more progressive groups of providing medicines, and well, they make two of the things I sell right and left are fantastic towards behavioral modification, but this Dr. Tynes, far left. To beyond that, Doctor, forgive me for not being more prepared for all this, but we're trying to work our way from left to right. Now, forgive me, Jay, how do you pronounce this church?
That would be Tischendorf.
Tischendorf, Dr. Tischendorf.
Difficulty. Yeah.
That's right. I can go forward with Dr. Tischendorf, holds a BS degree from zoology and went to they forgot the as the Ohio.
I'm Ohio University, not the Ohio
Not the
State.
Ohio, okay,
I'm
not
a
Ohio
Bobcat,
State.
Not a Buckeye.
Ah, okay. That's there you go. Colorado State veterinary degree. Serves as a regional veterinarian with Merck, which I was just in a meeting that is mainly thanks to them. His special interests include emerging zoonotic diseases, anesthesiology, dermatology, and animal cruelty forensics and investigations. Before that, he worked as an endangered species biologist and a wildlife firefighter. And in his free time, he trains natural resource professionals on wildlife tracking and mobilization. Former Marine and has lived in 15 states. Essentially, he could kick your tail and then heal you up. It's pretty darn impressive. Which, you know, it's a good handy thing, that's right. Forgive me oh, and then we've got, of course, Dr. Staubus is a veterinarian with a multitude of responses, training experience, including working with national welfare organizations, and a lead veterinarian in deployments with Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, and with PTSD service dog programs for veterans, which is magnificent, where I'm a practicing up in the Fort Hood area, and we deal with that all the time, and thank God for them. Dr. Staub is a national speaker, spokesperson, has delivered multiple courses in disaster planning and preparedness. She's a response partner with Louisiana, has played a critical role in building community resilience and response. We don't really have any specific plans. We want to hear from you and direct any questions you may have. And if you don't have any questions, I'll make some up here. So how can we open the floor to any questions you have for our illustrious panel here? Yeah, I don't know what to ask. Well, this being a behavioral cognitive, we all have interest in behavioral medicine. And what we might do is just start working from our left this way and talking about just behavioral medicine and speak for a few minutes each, starting on our special views, and see what y'all have to say. See if you're interested and have any questions that might pop up. Dr. Tynes, do you have any, would you like to talk about the behavioral medicines that SIVA has provided, or that you're with right now?
Well, yes, I guess I could say a few words about that.
Good.
Because I know most of you were not here, I guess, yesterday morning for the session when I spoke about the science of semiochemicals, so I guess I could say a few words more about that. Just like to be sure everybody is aware of the pheromone products we provide. One of the things that I have found interesting since I joined SIVA is that while many people have heard of Feel-Away, so kind of interesting show of hands, how many of you have heard of Feel-Away? And how many people have heard of Adaptil? Kind of good. That may be because we have such a great group of dog people here. But in the field, what I find interesting is that a lot of people have heard of Feel-Away and hardly anybody seems to have heard of Adaptil. So I like to be sure people are familiar with both of those products. Even though the Feel-Away has been out longer than the Adaptil, both of them have been out close, you know, between 15 and 20 years and have that many years of research behind them. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the pheromone products, they are simply synthetic analogs of naturally occurring pheromones produced normally by dogs and cats. And the thing about pheromones that I find really fascinating is that they are species-specific chemical messages that animals evolved for the purpose of communication. And interestingly, sort of in my field, I find that a lot of people sort of look up on it as a voodoo. They're all kind of like, look askance at it, until you've actually had some firsthand experience with it. And then most people that have had that are pretty hooked. So if you've had experience with it, you know it works. If you haven't, you're less likely to be impressed. But if you look at the data, if you look at the research, they're pretty interesting tools. And I always tell everybody that as a behaviorist, what I want are tools in my toolbox, right? Because I loved it. Who was it talked about yesterday? Who's smartest, right? Which animal's the smartest? Well, what's the best tool, a hammer or a screwdriver? Well, you can't say that because we need both. And I always ask people, well, do you think you could build a house with just a hammer? Of course not. Well, I can't solve a behavior problem with just Prozac. And I can't solve most behavior problems with just pheromones. But having pheromones in my toolbox is really, really helpful because a lot of times I use them along with other things. So all of that said, I guess, are there any questions that anybody might have about the use of those products for dealing with behavior problems? Yes? Excellent. Right. So the Adaptil, okay, so she's asking about exactly how the products might be used in rescue situations, and that's a great question because Adaptil is specifically a copy of what's called a canine appeasing pheromone. And appeasing pheromones are produced by mother animals and beginning at about the time they have their offspring, and they stop being produced at about the time they wean them. So again, from an evolutionary perspective, it appears that this is a chemical that's intended to help with social bonding, intended to help with calming offspring. But we've known from, again, the research that this is something that helps animals appear to feel less stressed, decreases signs associated with fear and anxiety in dogs of all ages. So the Adaptil product, again, this copy of canine appeasing pheromone, is available in collars, sprays, and diffusers. And a lot of shelters, for example, use these diffusers in the shelters where they can because they're basically producing, putting the pheromone out into the air full time. Other people find that spraying the sprays on bedding or even on bandanas that you might tie around the dog's neck for parts of the day can be helpful. The spray lasts about 4 to 5 hours when applied. But I think in a perfect world, it'd be nice if we could put Adaptil collars on our rescue dogs as soon as possible. Again, assuming they're not scared of being reached for and handled around their neck. I'm working with a group in Louisiana right now who's acquired some dogs from Korea who are extremely terrified, and they don't even want to touch them right now, right? So they're just trying to condition them to people. So in that case, we're trying to put the Adaptil in their environment. So again, you have these different ways of getting the Adaptil to them based on what's possible for that individual in that circumstance. A lot of shelters use these products, spray the sprays on their clothing when they go out to rescue animals. I know a lot of people who rescue cats, pick up feral cats for trap, neuter, release situations, like to spray Feel Away on their clothing before they go out and handle cats. So it can be very useful in that respect. So again, it kind of depends on what you're trying to do, but as a general tool for helping keep fear and anxiety down, very, very helpful. Hopefully, say it again. Right. So putting Adaptil collars on them could help. The collars last about 30 days. Again, along with your other, any other behavior modification you can do, classical conditioning, that sort of thing, decreasing stress in the environment. Again, I love it when we can get these rescued dogs into foster homes. They don't have to live in a shelter environment. When they're in a shelter environment, we talk about a lot of other things, right? Music, that sort of thing. Everything we can do to decrease stressors in the environment. But it's a nice tool to help these animals cope with what is clearly a stressful environment. And then if we can send them all home with an Adaptil collar and maybe encourage adopted pet owners to keep an Adaptil, to put an Adaptil collar on them every 30 days for the first couple of months. That's a study we're trying to work on putting together right now. Can we increase the chance that that dog bonds to its new owners and actually stays in that home? And maybe decrease some of the re-relinquishment issues that some shelters face. Does that help?
So, all the dogs that are there all have two people who take care of them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's not quite a
Right.
environment that, they are getting lots of attention, but we find that some are still, like, fear aggressive.
Sure. They were fearful from the get-go. So again, environment is not so stressful, but still we're trying to get the dog adjusted to a new environment and new people, and so it can be very, very helpful. Yes, good luck.
It's a great question. Yes, ma'am.
Right, those are great questions. One of the things about pheromones that's really fascinating is we're still really learning exactly how it has its effect on the brain. We know that the messages go to the amygdala, and there they're causing changes in neurohormones, but exactly the path that they follow and what neurohormones are being affected is still a little bit of a mystery. They're looking at things like oxytocin. There's some suggestion there that it's affecting oxytocin levels. But the way I like to put it, because it's sort of across the board, whether we're talking about pheromones or medication or, you know, natural supplements to relieve anxiety, is you can't learn when you're stressed, right? When you're under stress, when you're very, very anxious, or if you're very, very afraid, you can't learn. And we need these animals to learn oftentimes, right? New coping mechanisms, or they're just learning to trust. We maybe need to learn new skills. So by using a pheromone product, the idea is that we're helping put them in a state of mind where they are better able to learn. That's the goal.
Magnificent. We have, yes, ma'am, back there.
I am totally unfamiliar with the dog-related pheromone products. Are those available through your vet or pet stores, or where do you get them?
Actually, all of the above. Well, some veterinarians don't have them, some do, but you absolutely could probably go on Amazon and get them. And many of the large pet stores sell them. So they're readily available. It's not a prescription product because it's not an FDA product, and it is, again, considered a relatively natural product.
Most of the vet clinics I know, we carry it, crossroadsveterinaryhospital.com, and not that you have to go to our online store, but we do have it on ours. No, I believe it's a standardized price, so it ought to be about the same price wherever you go.
That's something actually Siva's really working hard on, is trying to keep some control over the price so that there's like an established minimum, because the online, this is another discussion, but the online companies really are kind of good at undercutting. It's almost like there's somebody searching, and the minute they see somebody with a lower price, they go in and make it lower, and they go in and make it lower until pretty soon, you know, nobody can afford to sell it. And so in the end, that hurts everyone. So yeah, we're trying to keep some minimum price there. And the other thing I like to remind people is when you have a behavior product with your pet, you want to be sure that you're getting professional advice. And that's my only concern. When people can just go online and buy stuff and they don't get the professional advice that could come with it through their veterinarian, I think there's always the chance of them going into it with just not the most appropriate, you know, perception or understanding about how to use it or when to use it or what to expect from it. So I like it when veterinarians will carry it and recommend it, and then we have special deals that veterinarians can offer their clients for buying it from them too. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get it and try to get the best price for it.
When Dr. Tischendorf, I think that segues somewhat into what I was curious about this when I was thinking about what you two do with disaster moments and things like that. I know the Merck company did a wonderful thing right after Harvey. Boy, they were all over Houston, and I was at a seminar up in Jackson Hole. They were talking about that. Do y'all get a chance to deal with? Obviously, you deal with wildlife too. Do you ever get a chance to deal with the stresses and the emotion? How would you play into what y'all do with regard to disaster with stresses? It's a weird question, I know, but
I had the good fortune, partly because of Dr. Staubus and American Humane, and I live in the Houston area, and so right as Hurricane Harvey hit, I had a very supportive boss and a supportive company in Merck who were willing to let me spend really the next 2 weeks volunteering in one of the animal rescue shelters that had been set up on an emergency basis, and American Humane was there in a very big way helping to run that shelter. So I give a lot of credit to them. Another group, Best Friends Animal Society out of Utah, was also quite instrumental in stepping up, as were an incredible number of volunteers from all walks of life, including, have to mention, 2 stories. One was a veterinarian who had lost his clinic and a adjoining bar that he had built in the Houston area by hand. He'd really constructed this. He's, too, was a former Marine, and literally within days of all of that, he was volunteering his time because he had a mobile radiograph unit. Todd Hayden is his name, and so such a selfless demonstration of putting the patients and others before himself and his family and his well-being. He was out volunteering because animals were being brought into the shelter that had orthopedic problems, other issues that could only really be addressed with radiographic technology. And here he was on site doing free radiographs to help out. Another real amazing story, I subsequently got transferred down to the sporting complex in Houston. We moved the animals from the Montgomery County shelter down to Houston to a more centralized facility once Houston had sort of stabilized. And there was a gentleman there volunteering. He'd show up at 6 in the morning coming off his shift as a bellman at the Hilton Hotel downtown, and would volunteer to help clean cages and walk dogs. And he was in his immaculate uniform. That Hilton had suffered pretty substantial damage but was still open and trying to operate. But he literally had lost his vehicle and his home in the hurricane, and yet...
It's amazing how
I'm
people-
sorry, I get choked up
But
because...
it's amazing how you'll see, I know we're off topic with this, but how people will step up in such a selfless way when all your pity would be on them for their personal situation. But I think we all learn, hopefully through our lives, that community service actually, you get more out than you give. But on the pheromone component of disaster response, the very nature of a temporary shelter that pops up in a disaster is about as stressful of an environment that you could put any animal into, including the human animal that is in there. And, the use of pheromones in that environment, could be a very helpful tool. And also, though, I think you should think about when we think of pheromones, and I assume everybody kind of knows what that is, but, a hormone is a chemical produced within one organism that moves about the organism and has effect on some other part of the organism, whereas a pheromone is produced by one individual, drifts through space or is moved, and affects another organism. And so when an animal is fearful, they squirt this stuff out, and it leaves residue. Yeah. And, if you are capturing animals in a disaster, many of them are not real excited about being captured and being saved, particularly cats. And, if you, for example, if you use a capture net and you have a cat in that capture net, if you go to put that capture net near a relaxed cat, the fear of the first cat will very quickly transfer to this other cat. And so I think we can think about that in our, in a shelter environment or in a veterinary clinic, or even in your own home. You can apply these thoughts, but we saw the images of the brain and how, the olfactory component for dogs, and I would assume cats exceed us substantially as well. I mean, you couldn't even see that in the human. We're like, we don't get it. But they do get it. And, it's that deal of just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not real.
That's right. And then alarm pheromones are a really good example of something I think we've kind of been ignoring in veterinary medicine for a long time. We know they're there. We should have known they're there. We're still learning a lot about them, but yes, they are there, and it's something to think about with the equipment you use to handle or transport animals and why it's so important to clean things thoroughly between animals, and to think about these things like a net, for example, that's really not easy to clean. But alarm pheromones can be a contributing cause. But your disinfectant, fortunately most pheromones are organic molecules that are easily killed by most of our disinfectants. But think about that when you're cleaning things. Use your disinfectants to kill things like alarm pheromones.
Even
because,
your own
it's a big
clothing.
deal.
If you've
Yes,
handled
if you've
an animal
handled a fearful
who has
animal.
been truly afraid,
you know, you might consider swapping out that shirt and washing yourself up and helping remove that evidence of fear so the next animal doesn't see you coming and think, oh.
There was a question in the back.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Right. That's a great question because it is a challenging field to be in right now. I like to say that veterinary behavior is not unlike human psychiatric medicine in that it's taken a while, or we're a little bit behind human psychiatric medicine, right? We're still a culture that's not fully accepting the fact that mental health is, you know, a real issue. It's not something to be stigmatized, et cetera. Well, veterinary medicine is even behind that. The veterinary schools are not teaching behavioral medicine to veterinarians on average. There's a very small handful of veterinary schools that are fully committed to teaching behavioral medicine. So the average veterinarian is not well versed on behavioral health. So that's the first thing you kind of have to do is get a feel from your veterinarian about how committed they are and how interested they are in behavioral health. And that itself, I know, can be hard. The veterinary behaviorists in this country, there are about 84 of us right now in the entire United States. So it is a very small but steadily growing specialty compared to the thousands of internal medicine specialists, for example. So your choice is to either try to seek a remote consult with a veterinary behaviorist that does that, and not many of them do. Most of us by law can't consult with a pet owner. We have to consult through the veterinarian. So sometimes by asking your veterinarian if they will consult with a veterinary behaviorist might be a good way to determine, again, how committed they are, how open-minded they are about behavioral health. So that's one place to start. The next place to be aware of is that there is an organization of veterinarians whom are not credentialed, who are not board certified, but who are interested in behavior, and that's the American Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior. And you can go online to that organization and see who their members are, and that at least tells you, if you can find a veterinarian near you who's a member, that they are interested in the behavioral health care of animals, and that's a good place to start. Without that, the challenge we face with veterinarians, unfortunately, is that they don't often know who to refer to. And this is sort of what led to my discussion and my presentation yesterday afternoon, because it depends on whether you're talking about a behaviorally normal dog or a behaviorally abnormal dog as to whether or not you need veterinary involvement or whether you need a trainer. Even if you need a trainer, you want to be careful, unfortunately, and I hate to say this, you have to be careful about accepting a veterinarian's recommendation of a trainer, because if the veterinarian is not well versed in behavior, they don't know how to recommend a trainer. So again, I urge you to go to the American Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior to get their guidelines for recognizing a trainer. right now, unfortunately, and I find this very disturbing, that the person who cuts my hair, the person who puts a roof on my house, the person who does my nails has to be licensed by the state. But the person who can do permanent damage to my pet can be anybody off the street with absolutely no education whatsoever. And I think most really good, well-informed, well-educated trainers are as concerned about that as I am. I've met several that are seeking to get states to do more certification. So you do, it's a bit of a buyer beware market when it comes to finding a trainer. Because again, anybody can call themselves a trainer, anybody can call themselves a behaviorist. You want to know, well, where did they go to school? Do they have a bachelor's degree even in animal behavior? Hopefully, I would want someone that has at least a master's degree in some behavior or psychology or learning. And in a perfect world, depending on the severity of the problem you're dealing with, maybe even a PhD.
And it's not only the lack of formal education that might be a concern, but it's the lack of any kind of oversight when there's no
Exactly.
regulation of it.
There's no regulating body.
Because that's the whole point of, for example, a veterinary license. It's like, well, the reason you maintain your license, is so the community can feel some sense of security in utilizing your services. And that leads to a veterinary board that has oversight. And that way, if there are complaints, there's a path for that license to be pulled so that the community can be protected. And that's unfortunate.
And it was an interesting discussion we had at a behavior meeting, actually, I was at recently. It was an interdisciplinary meeting, and I was so excited because there were trainers there who were talking about a group. It was actually, I think she was with CPDT, and they're talking about going to states and trying to seek certification or licensing by states. And I was like, wow, I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but just thinking that it might is really exciting. Because to me, licensure is about protecting the public. And when it comes to animals, now it's also about protecting welfare, right? Protecting the animals' welfare as well. So we need to go there. And in the meantime, unfortunately, like I said, it's buyer beware. And yes, the cost is a whole nother subject, but I have been surprised, believe me. I've had people come to me and say, I have spent thousands of dollars with trainers, and I still have a dog that's biting me. And it's horrifying because there are trainers out there who charge more than I do with my 10 years of higher education. So that's kind of part of the buyer beware. What are you paying for? Why does this person deserve that amount of money? And it's a big challenge.
Just as a side note, the person who does my hair does not have a license. But talking about the scientific theory and trying to use standardization of a group to try to better the behavioral group, I do kind of wanted to throw at Jay a second. We talked about scientific theory and trying to use science to move things along. Could you tell us, I guess it's a weird question I would have, but how would you advise the group out here to kind of step towards a scientific method, like searching for a board-certified behavioralist, not just someone who did a 5-minute Google and thinks they're a doctor? Merck, y'all's group, we were talking about science. Tell me what you were thinking about scientific approach and kind of generally what we try to do in our profession.
Well, I like to say that science is the most powerful force on earth next to gravity, and the scientific method and you've heard much of that at this conference, coming up with a hypothesis or an idea that something may work a certain way, and then we test it scientifically with an experimental design and a model and collecting data, and then objectively looking at that data. And the average, I think a big problem in society is the average person doesn't have that training in how to think in terms of critical thinking and sample size, and many of us get caught up in the cause and effect. Well, I did this and this happened, so it has to be related, and science will tell us whether or not it is or not. And so I think getting people to think about think more critically is really important, and that would be something that might be of interest if you're trying to find a behaviorist or a trainer. You know, tell me about your continuing education, what journals and magazines do you read, and hopefully some of those have some scientific basis to them. And so I don't know if does that answer the
Yeah.
question? But yeah, I just think science is such a powerful force, and we maybe more so today, we've lost track of that, and we're hanging our hat on anecdotal information and supposition rather than science and evidence. And so encourage everybody, if you're working with children in schools, I think that should be a really important part of curriculum, is critical, not what to think, but how to think.
Thank you, yeah. That's such a great point, because I can think of so many examples, and I hate to name names, but there is one particular celebrity trainer on TV who, when the discussion comes up, he's been heard to say, well, this is just my opinion, you know, as if that's okay. And I said, yes, but this is science. You know, we have research to back up what we're saying. And people seem to think, well, that opinion supports them. No, it's kind of different. You know, we're not just saying this because it's our opinion. We're saying it because it has science behind it. And I do think there are people out there that have gotten sort of in their head that, well, I don't know if science is to be trusted. And I like the example of the whole margarine butter thing. You remember when first science told us, oh, you shouldn't eat butter, margarine is better, and now they're telling us, oh, you should eat butter, margarine is bad for you. Oh, well, I'm just not going to believe anything. Well, no, that's the beauty of science. We learn new stuff. And it should direct how we think. Science should direct how we think. That's what it's all about.
And information changes.
Yeah, we learn new stuff.
Yeah, we sometimes learn what we didn't know.
Yeah,
And sometimes learn that we may not know
We
a lot.
learn we were wrong, and, you know,
And
I'll be
for-
the first to say, what I said 15 years ago in a particular chapter I wrote wasn't right. It was wrong. It's what I thought at the time, but then I learned new stuff, and now I speak differently.
And for those who are students, you know, and educators, hopefully understand that, you know, education's great. It's about exposing you to ideas and concepts, but the number one hope of that is to provoke you to think and question.
Yes, yes.
Many of us have learned to check things like WebMD or something like that for medical help for simple things and so on. I know this is not a simple thing to talk about behavioral medicine for animals any more so than it is for humans, but is there a reliable web-based source out there for information on some of the most reliably tested and scientifically proven things that do work?
I think that's a great question. I'd say we distribute that amongst all three. Being the moderator, I'll just be quiet. Lisa?
I'll be honest with you, I don't feel like I know the answer to that, quite frankly.
Jay, do you have any that you know of?
I will abstain because I don't follow that as closely as Dr. Tynes might, and I suspect she would have the most educated answer among us.
Well, I think if we're talking specifically behavior, there's not any like single place you can go, like any single site. I mean, I wish I could say, oh, it's the American College of Veterinary Behavior. We have all this great information on our site, but that's not what we do. The American Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior, which again, the organization of veterinarians that is committed to educating the public about behavior. What is on their site is certainly going to be accurate. It's just not complete. You know, they haven't been able to get everything out there they would like. So unfortunately, it's going to be through a combination of things, you know, textbooks or peer-reviewed journal articles or things like that. There's not any really good single web source. I could recommend, you know, several websites, maybe for different purposes, but not any single great site. The Fear Free Happy Homes website is a very reliable source, but again, it's not going to be all things behavioral. But I do feel what's on there is very trustworthy on that particular
I'll
subject.
make a couple comments,
Yes.
somewhat related, and Dr. Tynes alluded to this, but, and I've said this before, it boggles my mind as a veterinarian that in our profession of thousands, there are only roughly 90 veterinarians who have stepped up and undertaken the rigors of getting advanced training and ultimately board certification as a specialist in this area of behavior medicine. And there is nothing more ubiquitous or all present all the time in our lives as veterinarians, particularly as practitioners, than animal behavior. It's there every second of every day that we are in a clinic. The other thing that is there also is infectious disease, and many veterinarians are very savvy and fluent in infectious disease, but this one area of behavioral understanding in medicine, it boggles my mind. Less than 100 veterinarians in our history have stepped up, and as Dr. Tynes said, we've got thousands of board-certified internists and radiologists and oncologists and dermatologists and so on, and yet this important area, and it's happening gradually, and her discussion about some of the medicines and tools that are available today really reflects this, but until society collectively and we as a profession collectively understand and appreciate the devastating impact that behavioral problems have on animals, it is ultimately the single disease with the highest mortality of anything out there. All the animals that get euthanized because of behavioral problems. And until we collectively grasp and understand that, we will never, never surmount that problem. But I'm encouraged we're making progress, and all of you, I think, are a big part of that.
And I will say it's not for lack of interest. I like to be sure people understand that. I get calls still every year I get several calls from young veterinarians wanting to specialize, and the problem is that there aren't residencies for them. Again, you want to do an internal medicine residency. If you've got the grades and you've got the desire, you can go get one.
Anywhere.
But there's not a handful of behavior residencies available. There's about 6, and we have 30, almost 30 right now, veterinarians doing what we call non-traditional residencies. Those are veterinarians who are basically in private practice paying someone like myself to mentor them so they can become a specialist, because there aren't enough residencies. So if you want to make a change, there's an opportunity next time you're at a veterinary university. Talk to their administration about how they're falling down on the job.
Jay brought up a good point. We all get emails all the time from these big organizations like AVMA and AHA, American Animal Hospital Association, and the AVMA. I just received an email, it was probably last month, about a study in Europe that showed the biggest number of euthanasias of young animals was due to behavior. And it was the only class I think they taught us less about in vet school was business management. And it was really a joke, but we won't go into that. But yes, we deal with it every day, and it's not shiny. Y'all all have, how many people here are trainers or dealing with training animals and rescue animals and things like that? Y'all are all devoted to the heart and soul in love of the animal and the pet. And we're so focused on trying to learn in vet school the knowledge of how to help medically the pet, it was just not devoted to. They told us when we were in vet school that somebody accumulated all of the syllabuses and tried to figure out how many facts we had to learn. Y'all remember that? They said that someone had compiled it, and they said to make a C and graduate with a 70, which the old joke is, what do they call the person who graduates last in the vet school class? Doctor. But they said you had to learn a new fact during those 4 years of vet school every 2.5 minutes for 4 years straight, with no sleep, no eating, no holidays, at 365, 24/7. To learn a new fact every 2.5 minutes, no human can do that. So we have to go out and still learn more. And at that time, they were just so focused on getting us the essentials to be the animal mechanic. Y'all are focused on being the sports car driver to try to help them really get the most out of their quality of life. And we need to do the same. I think the AVMA is a good website. You can find a lot of things on the avma.org, I think it is. Another is veterinarypartner.com. I use Ven all the time, and I'm not plugging them, but I send home a lot of information from my clients about their pets that have medical cases, and they may have things on veterinarypartner.com. Top of my head, I just can't think of any other good ones, just a multitude of using more than anecdotal evidence. We have 4 stages of research, and the first top is with, we got, the researchers can tell you more about this than I can. I just know that the 4th one is the one we lean to, which is, we kind of got a gut feeling about this. Kind of like, I got vaccines as a baby, and now I'm fat. Therefore, vaccines made me get fat. That's not how it works, but that's how a lot of the information appears on the internet. So the internet's kind of a double-edged sword, but as long as you double back and present, another thing you can do is when you find things on the internet, if you have a trusted veterinarian you can turn to, we love talking about stuff and helping. And an email, a phone call, a coming in, anything you see, double check it with your doctor who you trust. And if they don't know, they can find somebody to send to. It's just not a lot of options out there. Did that pretty much answer your question on the websites and things like that? It's a great relevant question for science, because so often we have people just telling us, I had this one person in the family who had a dog years ago that did this, therefore my animal must have that. No. There's other things that do that too. Do we have, yes.
I have a question as a trainer who works with, like myself, who's definitely worked with the everyday pet parent who has, general behavioral issues and stuff like that. Now, it's good consulting you to say, okay, this is something to work on behaviorally, okay, this is something I think we need more help with. Unfortunately, especially, I guess, maybe in the locations that we're working with very clinically, we work with a lot of lower income patients and stuff like that who are saying, well, the closest behaviorist to me is in Houston, the closest behaviorist to me is in Dallas. And when you're in Texas, that means like a 3-hour drive. On top of having to come up with those funds and then coming up with the funds for the medications and then still doing the training with the dogs and everything. That's really stressful and frustrating for them. Is there a resource by any chance that's national or local to Texas perhaps, or that you can point in the direction of that can help them with that?
Again, it depends upon you having a veterinarian or those pet owners having a regular veterinarian that is willing to ask for help. If you know that their veterinarian is willing to participate in the care of this pet, which I hope they are, then there are resources. Number one, and my job in SIVA, one of the things I do is consult with veterinarians. So all they have to do is call me, and if a veterinarian is doing it, a lot of times I'll work with the trainer too. So for example, that veterinarian is not possibly going to be the best observer of the pet's behavior, but if the pet owner is also working with a trainer, you can be the one to send me information as well. But I have to communicate with the veterinarian primarily. But the veterinarian needs to be willing to communicate with a specialist and get help from them. And it is true, some of the other veterinarians that do that do charge for it. But those services are out there, and it's still cheaper than somebody having to take their pet to the specialist. So I'm pretty sure that Tufts still has, this is just for everybody's knowledge, still has a long distance, service that they provide, behavioral consult service they'll provide with veterinarians who want it. There's a clinic or behaviorist in Florida that is doing this through her website now. But again, the law requires that we do it through veterinarians, not through the pet owner. But that kind of consultation is available if people will just do it.
Are you asking more for a medicine specifically, or a nutritional supplement, or a dir-
Yeah. Right.
right?
Right. Right.
Yeah,
I mean, the point is, if you think that the pet needs help that is over and above basic behavior modification that may or may not involve medication, for example, then that's where we can help. But by law, I have to have that discussion with the veterinarian. I can't have it just with a pet owner or with a, and so that information is available. You know, we're happy to share it and give it to you.
It sounds like
And
you're
I'm just
asking
not
more
sure if-
patient assistance to help the family pay for, is that correct? Yeah. So one,
Sorry.
may be
Text.
possibly available, and that would even,
Texas thing, Texas Foundation thing?
it sounds like you could speak to
Yeah,
that possibly.
that's a good idea.
Yeah. There are possibly some organizations, Dr. Tynes, I think, mentioned the Texas Veterinary Foundation. I think they may have an indigent fund, or a fund for indigent pet owners. Some companies will do that if that particular medicine is in their company, if that's a medicine they make, they might have some
Do some shelters
opportunities.
maybe
The one-
assist people with
Yes,
something like that in order to try to keep a pet in its
Yeah,
home?
yes, yeah, county shelters would be worth. And the other plug I'll make, and I have no investment in pet insurance, but I do think in this day and age, somebody getting a new pet, it is well worthwhile to at least investigate the opportunity to get pet insurance at that time, because once a problem is in the medical record, it's now a pre-existing condition that most insurance companies won't pay for if you go buy insurance that day. But if at day zero, when you first get that pet, you sign up for pet insurance, they have great wellness plans, it's fairly reasonable cost, wide coverage depending on the plan that might include behavioral issues that develop.
You want to be
That
sure
can be a
they
great
ask
event.
about behavior
Yeah,
issues,
yes.
because some of them aren't covering it, but some, again, some of the insurance companies have a growing awareness that that's important.
Yeah,
So I agree, that's a good point.
something worth looking into.
Yeah.
How about the welfare, that, do y'all, are you aware of any groups that could do something like that, or?
I'm really not,
Not either.
just for the general population, you know, sadly. And, you know, when we were learning earlier in some of the discussion about, you know, how we looked at the rising cost of pet care over the last decades, and, you know, and we know that behavior is a number one health concern. And, you know, but, you know, so I don't know that I'm sorry, but I don't have help for you on that. But what I can say is that, you know, I work with vet students. I was on, you know, top vet students for quite a while. And, you know, it's not uncommon to have a vet student tell you, you know, when you say, well, why do you want to be a veterinarian? And the normal response is, well, because I love animals. And, but then if they follow that with, you know, and I really don't like people, well, that's a big problem, because quite frankly, I don't know about you guys, but the reason I'm so passionate about helping animals in disasters and helping veterans with animals is because we know that the power of that human-animal bond, you know, arguably maybe doesn't increase your lifespan, but it's important to us. I mean, we've learned that in disaster responding. You know, Hurricane Katrina proved that if you bring in public transportation to move people out of harm's way, and you tell them, oh yeah, but we're not letting animals on that bus, they will not get on that bus. They'll stay on that roof and potentially die, or stay in a fire zone and potentially die because they can't get their horses out. So our concern for animals' behavior is crucial, and I commend you and the whole specialty devoted to this, because it's not only helping these animals who are suffering because they clearly are. But right along with them, they're human suffering too. And, when you say, like someone has spent thousands of dollars on a dog that bites them,
Yeah.
it's because we need to help, we have that burning need for that bond. And so, sadly, free Medicare for all is not really a reality, and it's not a reality for our pets either. Capitalism has its downsides.
And I apologize for misunderstanding your question, but I would add, it's the special products, I'll admit, even the pheromones are not cheap. The Zilkene I've mentioned, the Angstitane, things like that aren't cheap, but, you can get the Prozac, and I think people don't realize this, fluoxetine, you get $4 a month, $10 a month. It's pretty cheap to treat your pet for these medications. It's the services, even, training and the behaviorist fees that are expensive, not the medications.
Why do you think that is, just like why write a salad at $10 might be the cheaper than frying a steak before? So why are we making these family things that might not be as induced for them? Why is that so expensive to distribute? Because on your line of work, wouldn't that be more helpful to make sure at every disaster that was available?
Yeah.
Because you had mentioned families are species specific.
Right.
So what we give to the dog wouldn't help to humans.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a great thing to point out. Fortunately, there's an easier answer than there is to the question of the whole salad, burger and fry issue. Because the fact is generic medications are cheap to make. Pheromones, just as one example, our pheromones come from France. Sometimes I think on the very slow boat from France, but anyway, they're truthfully rather expensive to produce, so it really is a cost issue. And every time a new drug comes out, it's going to be expensive. So that's the issue. Right now, we're lucky that we have a lot of great psychotropic drugs that are generic and they're cheap. But again, the first time some new, wonderful new drug comes out that we all think is the greatest thing since sliced bread, it won't be cheap.
And that's a function of development and
Yeah,
research
it
time
costs
that
money
goes
to
into
bring
that.
them.
It takes
Yeah.
probably 7 to 10 years to get a drug through all of the process, and many hundreds of thousands fall out. They're just not, they prove to be failures. So of those, the handful that make it to actual patent and the marketplace, it's a huge investment, and it's risky for companies. And so, they do need to recoup some of that.
And they
so
have to
can-
recoup that money, what, in the first, is it 10 years or something, or 7
yes,
years?
yeah,
Because they
because-
have to get
because
it
the
all back
patent's
quick
gone.
The
before it
patent will
goes,
expire,
right,
yeah. And you have to
generic.
have the patent in place long before you actually get the drug approved for the marketplace, and so there's already a lag. I will comment that most of the companies, Merck included, are very proud to donate and provide in a philanthropic way product to different causes. We've partnered with the American Humane on our Home Again microchips. We provided a lot of product for the Hurricane Harvey and other disasters, the wildfires, to try to help in those emergency situations. We've provided over 1 million doses of a human drug in Africa to help stamp out the ailment called river blindness, which is a terrible malady of people in many third world countries. Other activities like that, and not just Merck, all of the companies step up, and so I try to give credit to the pharmaceutical industry. Not perfect, but we do try.
Right, yeah, and actually, I didn't necessarily want to just brag on my company, but brag on a couple of my colleagues who filled a truck and drove all night long to Houston after Harvey to actually deliver a big truckload of pheromones and Vectra after Harvey, because,
think
yeah,
we
we
used some of
do
that.
try to get the pheromones to those places, because you're absolutely right, they're needed, and we do try to have a budget for that sort of thing, but it is unfortunately an expensive product to make and ship because of the technology.
Dr. Bailey, you had a question earlier. Did that get addressed?
well, this veterinarian walked into a bar. No, I'm sorry, that's the wrong joke. That's a family show. I'd pass that on. Do you have any heartwarming with all the stuff you've done?
Yeah, you must have.
I was going to say.
Yes. There was mention of the selflessness that we see sometimes during disasters. Disasters, by their nature, they bring out our very worst and our very best, and sometimes those are just seconds apart. But it's fascinating that, someone who has lost their entire home and everything else, and how they can even face the next day and start to think about putting their life together, I'm not even sure. And yet, they will step forward and come to some temporary shelter that's full of animals they do not know. Some of them, came from a home, and so we can all think that, well, we're helping, hopefully, eventually, maybe reuniting a family that, that's going to be, but many of them, quite frankly, a disaster sometimes is the best thing that ever happened to a stray dog, because nobody cared about it until that moment. But I must say that, so many times in a disaster, like for example in Montgomery County, following Hurricane Harvey, there were approximately 500 animals in that temporary shelter, if you added up, dogs, cats, and a little bit of livestock. Yeah. And out of those, sadly, there were only a few, handful, compared to 500, a small number of reunifications that occurred. But I can tell you, when you have someone who has lost everything, and maybe even family members, following a classic example was after the wildfires that burned around Chico, California, and everybody probably knows the little town of Paradise that no longer exists. Well, we had animals that we were responded to that, and we had animals, and when the owner would come in, in this case we were actually assisting a Red Cross human shelter, and we had a co-location shelter. We're just across the street, just about from me to you, was the animal shelter, so that if you were displaced by the fire, you could come and you could stay in the Red Cross shelter. They wouldn't let the animals stay in with them, even though that's a really better model, and Red Cross is coming along. But we would care for their animal for them. And to see someone tell you that, okay, I'm 83 years old, I lost my home, I lost my vehicle, everything I ever owned or cared about burned away and is so incinerated it's unrecognizable. Oh, and by the way, my caregiver perished in the fire. But I've got this 18-year-old cat who, quite frankly, is starting to show the signs of kidney failure. Please take care of my cat. And when you see that someone can be at a total breaking point, but if they can hold that animal, somehow it pulls them up, and they can realize, tomorrow's a new day. And so that's one of those things that is so strong. And, our animals mean that much to us, not to everyone. And as we saw, there's cultural differences and all. And, but to us in this environment, they mean tons to us.
The human-animal bond situation is stronger than we realize, yeah. Oh, you got a neat, positive, uplifting story.
Wow. Well, thank you for asking, because this to me is just one of the most remarkable stories of the human-animal bond and public health, all of these things coming together, modern medicine in the day. It's almost 99 years ago to the day today that the Great Race of Mercy was going on. The village of Nome, Alaska was in the throes of a diphtheria outbreak that was killing primarily Inuit children in a terrible way. And although aviation was available, it was in its infancy. Locomotive service was potentially available, but you're dealing with, 80 below wind chill factors, drifting snow, utter darkness in Alaska. and the Great Race of Mercy took place to bring this life-saving diphtheria antitoxin to the village. And the experts of the day had to rely on what I call the time-tested triad of the North: a wooden sled, a dog team, and a person who knew how to handle that team. And the individuals that led the last two legs, as many of you know, Balto, the lead dog, this I think would have been his 100th birthday, right around now, and Gunnar Kaysen, the musher, who led the last two legs. I always try to give credit. There's another team that was largely unrecognized, but arguably may have done more. That was Leonard Sapala and his lead dog Togo, literally covered almost 100 miles of that trail. Gunnar Kaysen said that at times he could not see his mittened hand in front of his face because of the blowing snow and the darkness. And those dogs unerringly found their way on that trail to that village and delivered that life-saving serum. And to me, that's just an amazing story, the bond of those dogs and the musher, the commitment of people to help their fellow man, and these dogs unknowingly that they too were implicated in this amazing story of life-saving adventure. And today, of course, we honor that as the Iditarod. So just to me, it's a huge and important, amazing story. Balto actually is taxidermied. If you're ever in Cleveland at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, it's a beautiful animal. It's a beautiful taxidermy job. And of course, he's preserved in bronze in Central Park and in Disney films and things like that. So, yeah. To me, that's a human-animal bond story par excellence.
Absolutely.
Valerie, that's you.
Wow. Well, so many, but I guess if I'm going to get to wrap it up, I would say I remember the first time I read Leo Bustad, and if none of you have read work by Leo Bustad, I urge you to. It was when I was a young wannabe vet student when I started reading about this thing people were calling the human companion animal bond. And I was one of those kids that wanted to be a veterinarian because I loved animals. But I never thought, well, I don't like people. I just loved animals. But I'm so lucky that I read that book because what it focused me on was the fact that, wow, our relationship with animals is a beautiful, miraculous thing. And having lived now with multiple dogs and cats and rats and snakes and all kinds of other interesting things over the years, I just continue to realize every day more and more what a beautiful relationship, or what a beautiful thing it is to have a relationship with an animal, and how lucky we all are to be here and share that drive and that love. So every time I go to a meeting like this and hear wonderful people way smarter than me, I am re-inspired, and every time I talk to people who are here to learn and driven by this same passion, I am re-inspired, and I just feel like it's, it gives me hope to go out and keep doing what I do, because we're all striving for that same thing, to make this world a better place for those animals, and I think it means we'll do it. We're gonna make a difference, we're gonna make a change because it's been happening. And because we all want to see that great relationship honored and improved, and
There's a lot of good stuff we go through. I mean, I've had the dog we diagnosed multiple myeloma on that was coming in for the chemo, and he'd come in with this tennis ball in his mouth, and he'd drop it. We did our treatment. We just put the tennis ball back in his mouth, and he'd trot right back out to his parents, And I did have a dog save the family's life when their house caught on fire and the dog barked and woke them up and got them out of there. So I hear little stories like that all the time, but I forget them because we deal with so much difficulty and challenge too that it tends to kind of make us forget the good moments because we're kind of washed out by some difficulties. It's not just, we joke about it. It's not, everyone thinks, oh, you're a veterinarian, you just play with puppies. No, we don't. Every now and then we get to see a puppy and we have that moment of joy. But what would y'all, if I could ask the panel kind of one at a time, we'll just start at this end. What would be the biggest challenge to you of what you do within your variation, and kind of run with that ball for a sec?
I'm so brutally aware of, because I just can't get away from it, which is probably similar to many of you, of the fact that these behavioral problems, or and some of that having to do also with, you know, failure to spay and neuter pets that can lead to some more of that and all, but all these problems that impact these animals, in many cases, these animals end up in an open admission shelter because, you know, as taxpayers, we all know, well, we can't have packs of wild dogs running the streets. It's not particularly safe. But our communities bring these animals to these shelters, drop them off, and, you know, and we let them leave feeling pretty good about themselves that, you know, they took it to a shelter. They didn't just abandon it, and that's good. But I think it would be very helpful if the community was a little more conscious about what the kill floor looks like every day, and how there is body after body of often young, healthy animals, that their big crime was that they weren't neutered and they were, you know, whatever, and they're laying there going cold, and the impact that that has on those people who are probably making about minimum wage, having to clean up the mess of our society. And I think it's really cruel of us as a society to do this to these individuals, much less the animals. So I just hope we can, and I think we are in some, you know, in my lifetime, I've seen what I considered an awakening, that this bond we seem to have, this freakish bond with our pets, its impact on us is huge. And, you know, we should take the impact on the people that run rescues and run shelters as seriously as we take the impact on the animals. And because, you know, both are at least equally important. And I think community awareness is helpful to that. You know, many shelters, you know, no shelter wants to be known as a kill shelter. Well, a no-kill is actually a misnomer in every possible way. And if you are a no-kill shelter, and yet in the other place in your town where animals end up, and you're no-kill because you won't let the animal come in if you don't have room for it. But the municipal shelter, or the shelter that's partnered with the community, they must take them in. They're legally obliged to take them. So the hard reality is there's only so many cages, and if you overcrowd your shelter, well, up go your behavioral problems, and then you really decrease the chances of those animals remaining healthy to where they are not just returned immediately. So I think that it would be very helpful if our community went ahead and opened the door and looked at that kill floor and accepted that, yep, that's what we did. You know, because I hear people say, oh, how can someone stand there and put those animals down every day? It's just so appalling to me that they can do that. They do it because they care. They do it because they know if that shelter's overcrowded, every animal in there potentially will have to be killed. And so I just hope that we can get over this stigma of kill, no-kill shelter, and we can all be more realistic about it. And I think it's much better to stand up and look at the truth and really look at it. And it's not pretty. So that you have a chance to think about how are we going to change things and how are we going to get out of that. Because veterinarians cannot spay and neuter our way out of it. And we can't be expected to do our services for nothing unless we work for a company that lets us do it, which that's what I feel like. I feel like I get paid to go volunteer. But it really comes down to responsibility in the individual pet owner. And probably we need to start with children about 3, talking to them, because once you're 30, it's probably too late.
Thank you, Lisa. Really beautifully said, and I agree. It goes back to the comment about, you know, learning critical thinking and understanding the facts, what's going on in this world beyond our homes, the shelters and so on. And remember, those of you that were here last night, the band and its beautiful song, Our Castaways.
Yes.
Says it all right there. My comment, dear colleague, is that, there's a ton of threats to global health, big ones, and the World Health Organization, as of January 1st this year, actually singled out anti-vaccine sentiment as one of the top 10 most significant threats to global health. And my concern is that we already, in our world as veterinarians, deal with many under-cared for, underserved pets who don't get regular veterinary care. Vaccines, deworming, parasite prevention, just medical care for problems, behavioral issues. And now as this anti-vaccine sentiment expands, that will trickle down to people and their animals. Oh, we're over-vaccinating our pets. They don't need to be vaccinated. If you've never seen a child die from diphtheria or scarlet fever or rubella, you've never seen a case of rabies, your parents didn't die in the Spanish flu outbreak of 1917, we've lost that visceral knowledge of how terrible these diseases are, and all of a sudden the vaccines become the boogeyman, the bad thing. And so I hate to say that we need another outbreak of some terrible zombie apocalypse disease to remind everybody how important vaccines and preventative care are, but that may be what it takes. And so that to me is one of the big issues and challenges in our world. My other issue personally is there's not enough time in the day to embrace and act on all the opportunities that come to me as a representative of a large pharmaceutical company where we do have some capability to help and assist. We can't do everything, but I always tell folks, ask. I may have to say no, but if you don't ask, I can't say yes. I just wish there was more time in my day to do it all, but we do what we can. So, thank you for letting us be part of this great conference.
That's pretty cool. Valerie?
Biggest challenge?
Yeah.
Could almost just sum it all up by saying ignorance. And that's really just what you all have already said. I was sitting here thinking anybody that thinks there's something wonderful about a no-kill shelter should think very carefully about a dog that's lived in a cage for a year or 2 years, because that's what I see when I go to no-kill shelters.
It's almost like
Anybody that thinks, vaccinations are horrible needs to go to India and see somebody die of rabies.
Well, just in our time in veterinary medicine, if you are practicing veterinary medicine in a reasonably affluent community, you kind of get you don't see distemper, for example. And you can let your guard down to where you start to realize, oh, that dog with a snotty nose. And yet, if you happen to be finding yourself in a community where there's a very low incidence of vaccination, distemper can spread through and devastate dogs. I've seen whole shelters practically have to be euthanized if they weren't already near death. And so, we've learned a lot about vaccines actually, and, they're on the other note, there are some issues that, adjuvants and things that in vaccines that are potentially problematic, but we've come a long way. And modern vaccines are far superior to what was available even 20 years ago. So, but yet the stigma of vaccines often can be very much linked to adjuvants and other issues.
Preservatives, things that,
Or-
that have been,
Complete misunderstanding.
yes.
I agree. How about, as for your, what do y'all, veterinary medicine, you're talking about your challenges. Do we have other questions out there before I go off on tangents and? Yes.
Did you say in school and then and now, is behavioral issues taught at all, or just minimal?
It's taught.
And is it taught as a disease, like you had mentioned? Because the way you mentioned it as a disease and the number one killer, it seems like if it was accepted as a disease
Right.
in school, then it should be sort of at the top of the list.
Right. There are 2 or 3 really good behavior programs in vet schools right now. Most vet schools teach nothing in the way of behavior. A few have a veterinary behaviorist that comes in and teaches a week or 2-week course.
But I mean, when
But-
they teach it a mental health issue, or do they just teach it as this needs training and we're gonna?
No, those that teach it as a disease state. And again, one of the reasons we also feel strongly about having veterinary behaviorists teach these courses, because there's a couple of schools who have like PhD behaviorists teach their courses, or even one school we heard lately had a trainer coming in to teach a course, and we got a little upset about, is because we believe that veterinarians need to be taught by veterinarians, because the most important role we play is in helping understand and recognize the difference between a true medical condition, again, like I talked about yesterday, sort of that role of pain, discomfort, and how it affects behavior, or how a dog with Cushing's disease behavior is changed, right? So sort of that very complicated interrelationship between health and behavior is absolutely taught where any good behavior is taught.
But like you point out, something that is, the number one disease that will lead to the death of your patients ought to probably rise to the surface, we would think, right? Well, on that same note, we all know how important oral health is. Most of us are pretty conscious of the importance of our own oral health, and it's linked to our overall health. And yet, quite frankly, dentistry is another component that is woefully missing in the veterinary curriculum. But in defense of, veterinary education is like, well, it's a 4-year program, on top of your bachelor's degree. Who would expect your MD, who had gone to their 4-year program, to be the dentist, to be the psychologist, psychiatrist, to be the dermatologist, to be the radiologist, the chemotherapist? Who would expect that? We would not expect that in human medicine. We understand that requires specialty and more training, and we get that because, quite frankly, the knowledge base is huge and ever expanding. And so, we are moving towards where more and more of our veterinary students, when they complete that, what would literally be their 8th year of college, and they've got the student debt to go with it, a increasingly large percentage of them follow up with either an internship or try to get into a residency program for further education into more of a specialization. Veterinarians are supposed to be a mile wide and about a half-inch deep, as opposed to about this wide and miles deep. And that's what a specialist is. And so, it's sadly
It's a
the
challenge.
nature of, it's just a lot. And I don't think it's quite fair to expect a general, to expect just a general practitioner to have all the answers, but hopefully they will know where to help guide to those answers, and hopefully this pressure will affect the veterinary curriculum, and then, sadly it may have to expand in the time.
Just quick,
Yeah,
I
please.
had to chuckle a little bit when my colleague Logan was talking about the facts that we had to remember in vet school. And what popped into my head, made me chuckle, was the Clark's Nutcracker that can remember 10,000 locations for its pine nuts that it's hidden in the northwest woods. And that's a bit like being a veterinary student, remembering 100,000 facts. So,
Well, I could make a joke right there. I'm not gonna.
Years ago, I was sitting here thinking, I bet that would be a fact for every 20 seconds now,
Nowadays,
if you calculated that.
But like you bring out about behavior, I just came back from we all have to get continuing education, and a minimum is never enough. We all go well beyond that. I was just at a seminar where there's 20 different classes going on every hour on the hour, and 2 rooms were devoted to a new behavioral topic for 4 days straight every hour. And we do go and try to further our knowledge as new things come along. And it's not just one disease, cognitive deficiency syndrome, you've got fear anxiety versus aggressive behavior towards strangers. There's a lot of different things that we deal with, and trying to minimize drug and maximize just behavioral activity. We do want to do that and try to do that. So I don't want to make it seem like we're not trained. there's so much to pursue and know. We try to do our best to learn everything we can while we're taking care of this case over here and that case over there that's different. And that's kind of the challenges that was referred to as. But it is something that, y'all may not know this. Did y'all know that veterinary medicine has the highest suicide rate of all the professions out there right now? We surpassed dentists, yay.
It's right
So-
up there with shelter technicians.
Yeah, I was going to
Uh-huh,
say,
yeah.
because of the things we deal with. We deal with more heartache. The studies show not only do we come out with a higher debt to income ratio than any of the other medical professions, but we also deal with, believe it or not, and this is just my reporting from another conference I went to, they said that the highest, we deal with death more frequently than any other profession. And that's not even just the kill flow, that's just a regular practice. We sometimes put 4 to 5 asleep a day that are sick and old, and it's usually during the holiday months. The highest euthanasia rate is during Christmas. And theoretically, why? It's people coming in and like, oh, we haven't seen you in forever, boy, Fifi's looking bad. And oh, I'm gonna go on this trip, go see family, and the dog's barely walking, so maybe it's time. And that, you can't be human without that taking a little toll on you. I mean, it gets you. And sometimes we go home and just, I won't say.
Self-medicate
Yes,
often?
yes, there's beer, there's bourbon. No, it gets rough, but there's the benefits to it way outweigh the other. We get a chance to help animals, but we just, there's challenges, there's pricings, there's a lot to it. But I'm the moderator, I shouldn't be talking this much, I'm sorry about that. But, yeah, when you talk about those, did you have another question out there that, yes ma'am?
Touching on what you were just talking about, I know that coming from the trainer with Dr. Sophia in is just a huge, huge, wonderful thing. Is she valued the same way the veterinary is?
Well, she committed suicide. I don't know if you're aware of that, yeah.
Yes.
She was tremendously respected and still is. Her work lives on. And
A legend in shelter
Yeah.
medicine.
Yeah, tragic.
Yeah, I
Huge
think
loss.
Sophia really, I would like to think what happened with her started a lot of this attention to the suicide issue. I know that she was already talking with Marty, she'd already started the low stress handling thing and was talking with Marty Becker about the Fear Free initiative. And that year after her death, we dedicated our annual meeting to her and talked about, let's not let her death be in vain. Let's carry on what she had inspired us all to be and to do. So I'd like to think at least some of us, she meant a great deal to us. We still talk about her, and
Thank you.
I recommend her book at every single fear-free meeting I speak to, so.
I think the Fear Free has been such a great benefit with the Fear Free clinics, which ours is going towards that, and the embracing of positive reinforcement and getting away from the Cro-Magnon knuckle dragon mentality we used to have in the 40s and 50s. But in medicine, like I guarantee Dr. Bailey can train a dog better than I can. I may fix a knee better than he can, but we're constantly trying to embrace that, but we need help from trainers who are very knowledgeable like that. It's just something we need to work together as much as we can.
Well said. Yeah. Team effort.
Any other questions? Any curiosities? Yes, ma'am.
I think AKC is certainly an iconic organization in our world of animal health and animals. Incredible. They've done a great job over the years with many things, including funding a ton of great research programs to a huge degree. So yeah, I give them a lot of credit. I'm not sure I agree with them on everything, but that's true of anything, you know.
They've
and so
also-
again, let's find the common ground rather than the differences. So, you know, I would embrace them. Yeah.
And even though I'm one of those people it's really hard for me to choke down dog breeding when we're killing so many dogs, yet I must say for the AKC, with disaster response, they have funded community after community for disaster response trailers, and they've really been important because the thing with disasters, it's you can't stop the disaster. It's about being prepared and trying to mitigate the damage to you and your community. And so, you know, I commend them for these things.
What do you think?
I would agree in that respect. I think what they've done by being more inclusive and trying to be more involved in other things besides just being a purebred dog registry, I think on the one hand it's probably just smart of them and keeping themselves alive, but obviously has shown that they can do a lot of good as well. And, you know, I agree. I would like to see them step up to the plate and change, you know, certain breed registries. Like, let's, for example, say Doberman pinchers don't need to be shown with, you know, cropped ears after X, certain year or something like that. I think that's the way we need to go, but that's my opinion. Excuse me?
Same story with boxers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, certainly with other breeds. And just because, I guess the reason I'm willing to speak up and say it is because I know the UK is starting to move that way, and I think we should as well. I mean, they're starting to do a little bit more breed shaming about things like the French Bulldog and the English Bulldog. That's why I spoke up and asked questions about it today. I'm like, at this, you know, time, why is that breed becoming so popular when it's such a poster child for deformity and
I would go so
defect?
far as to say, which, you know, I'm hoping might be slightly controversial, I would go so far as to say that breeding a dog who, if it gets pregnant and you don't intervene, is going to die, or if you leave it outside where you live for so many hours, it's going to die. And quite frankly, overheating or dying in childbirth, those are pretty tragic and horrible deaths. So I wonder how ethical it is to want to do that.
Great point.
And you know, when we looked earlier at the uptick in expense of animal ownership, strangely that matched right along with the uptick in designing dogs that are as freakish as we can come up with because we think weird's cute. But weird is not always healthy, and sometimes weird really hurts. You know, and then you have that French Bulldog, and then now airlines are saying, whoa, you're not putting it on my airline because there's a real good chance it'll die with just a little bit of stress on it. And so, I don't know, but I think that if you really love animals, we might really want to think about generating animals that we're choosing them because we think some physical feature is interesting, and yet we're really not choosing for health. And yet those street dogs that only, you know, what percentage was that made it to adulthood, basically to reproductive age, talk about a smart, healthy lot. I actually drag back dogs from Cozumel, Mexico really regularly. And I'll tell you what, they are the hardiest, smartest little creatures I know. And they have been selected by their own natural selection to be that. And we are selecting dog breeds to, I mean, just look at golden retrievers. Fabulous dog. But within all that breeding, we've put in real problems into the King Charles Cavalier. Cute, looks like a puppy all its life, till it dies from heart disease, way too young. And so, I don't know, I just hope we'll think about our dog breeding from an ethical standard. Sometimes what you can do is not necessarily something you should do. Just my opinion.
Well said.
Well said.
So how do y'all feel about ear cropping? and say no, yeah.
I'd rather have most of my ear personally.
I think they're cute, flopping ears. I mean, the floppy ears. I think a Doberman with floppy ears is cool.
They don't look as intimidating. They'll get along better in public, too, if they look a little more houndy, like they were born to be.
Yeah.
Then we turn them into some alien
Meant to
creature.
be.
Tails, too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
tails too.
You know, if a dog has broken its tail, or it's bludgeoned the end of its tail to the point where it won't quit bleeding and all, there's a time to dock a dog's tail, and I can kind of get it in certain hunting situations, maybe, but just for style, really.
Well, here's another one that's even more common and to me is every bit as much of an issue, dew claw removal in dogs. They've evolved to have those for reasons, and so many people just have this mindset, oh, you have to take that off. I'm like, well, I've never seen a wolf in the wild, and I've seen a lot and handled a lot of wild wolves that had lost its dew claw because of some snagging injury. I've seen my own dogs use the dew claw to remove foxtails from their eye and other things, and so I was always opposed to dew claw removal, and yet there are a ton of people who just, oh, that's what we're supposed to do, is take the dew claws off. So
And somehow it's okay because you do it so young.
yeah,
No,
With-
yeah.
I like
without
that
any
argument,
anesthesia.
too. I'm like,
yeah.
Step and go.
no.
Yeah. So removal can actually lead to increased injuries. Yeah,
Interesting,
It
yeah.
doesn't. Yeah, again, wolves do a lot of quick movements, quick turning, and I've never seen a wild wolf that had injured or lost its dew claws. So.
But it does keep them from working their way up the evolutionary ladder with opposable thumbs, so. you know,
Taking over the world.
You gotta keep things balanced a little bit. You bet.
Keep them in their place.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Any other questions we can present to the panel? I mean,
I'll just throw one humorous thought, and not to be flippant, but Dr. Stabas had mentioned the town of Paradise and tragically lost, but just sort of a friendly hint, never name your community Paradise
Boy,
if
yeah.
you want to avoid problems, and never name your dog Lucky if you
Boy,
want to
no
avoid
kidding.
problems with your dogs. And most veterinarians will tell you the dogs named Lucky generally aren't real lucky.
it's gonna lose its eye someday. Yeah, it's gonna have a nucleation. But who needs two eyes?
Little veterinary humor.
Yeah.
Please
we're
don't name
not-
it Fang either.
We're not quite right. Would y'all like to know any specific little personal Yes.
Like a veterinary behavior appointment, like kind of what we do? Oh, that's a great question. You know, happy to answer it. We get that all the time because people don't really always have a good understanding of what it is that we do. My appointments, and I think most of my colleagues, now there are a few exceptions, but let's say most of them, we have probably like a 15, 20-page history form that we send out and ask that people fill out before they come in. And I like to get my history forms back a good few days in advance because I like to study them pretty thoroughly before the appointment. I tell people to be prepared for a 2 to 3 hour appointment, and I do spend a good amount of that time reviewing then the history with them, asking additional questions that I usually let the history form kind of direct me to deeper things I want to know. To get sort of a better idea, I'm usually looking to try to understand a little bit about why the animal is exhibiting the behavior it's exhibiting. And while we say that what we're trying to do is come up with a diagnosis, I will admit that that is a loosely used term because we don't fully understand the underlying I guess, neuropathology, if you will, behind what we see in these animals. But basically, that's what we're trying to do. Again, are we truly dealing with separation anxiety, or is this a dog that's just frankly understimulated and just looking for something to entertain itself with, right? Something like that. Is this a dog that's urine marking in the house because he's anxious, or was he never properly house trained to begin with, right? So that's what I'm looking for. What's the diagnosis? So that may take the first hour or so, and then I try to develop a plan, basically a behavior modification plan for this individual that will work for them, and that's a good part of it, because I don't see myself as just saying, you're going to go home and do this and this and this and this, right? Because I know that's not always going to work. If I just tell somebody, do this, they may not be able to, right? So it's usually a good part of it is figuring out, well, we need to, let's say, keep your dog with separation anxiety from being able to roam your home and destroy things, because I understand if it does that, your husband's ready to euthanize it. How do we do that? What does that look like to you? So we look for temporary management solutions first, and then we work out, again, how will we modify this behavior? And it will usually be, a series of behavior modification exercises, or what the initial plan will look like. And then we may talk about medication and other tools. And usually I then send them home with initial instructions for doing that, and then send home further written instructions within a few days. And after that, it does depend a lot on what we decided. In a perfect world, I would like my clients to have a trainer then to help walk them, to kind of, as I say, hold their hand to do a lot of that behavior modification. And most of my clients where I live don't have that. So there may be a lot of follow-up with me on the phone or by email, or having them, if they're having a challenge with something, I'll say, well, video that for me and send it to me and let me see what that looks like. And then I try to hold their hand, again, sort of virtually as much as possible. Many of my colleagues who work in areas where their clients don't have to drive 3 or 4 hours to see them, maybe have people come back every 4 weeks for maybe hour appointments, and they don't have to do the big 2 to 3 hour thing. So some of that depends on where you're located, unfortunately. And that's just, again, part of the challenge of the fact that there aren't enough of us really to serve everybody everywhere. But that's kind of roughly what we do. Does that help? Okay, you're welcome.
You say an hour? How much did you allot for that?
So I'm
3
usually 2 to 3 hours are my appointments. But like I said, I have a colleague, especially in Florida, who's really working on what she calls doing more of a medical model, where she has hour appointments where she goes in and evaluates the pet and then turns it over to a trainer. And she has people come back regularly for an hour, and they do, recheck training appointments and stuff like that. And she's able to offer her services a little bit cheaper prices because they're paying one fee to see her and a different fee to see a trainer and things like that.
Well, trainers can add certain things we haven't been taught, so that's good.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, no, but
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
just to follow up, there was a question earlier about online resources, and one of the reasons I think there isn't necessarily, to my knowledge, a really comprehensive online behavioral guidance resource is exactly what Dr. Tynes articulated. Every case is different, and there are so many variables that fit into that specific situation with that animal, that family, that individual owner, the environment. And so it's difficult to have a single resource online that can encompass all of that.
Yeah. It's a good point. I mean, because I do teach actually I do an hour-long presentation for veterinarians where I say, you actually can solve behavior problems with these 3 easy steps. Well, for example, one of the steps is stop allowing the animal to practice the behavior. This is kind of what I was saying there. Yeah, stop allowing the practice of the behavior. That's easy to say, but in my appointment, what we're doing is figuring out, well, what does that look like in your household? If your child is being bitten by your dog, does that mean your dog lives behind a baby gate when you can't watch? If your dog runs at the door and attacks strangers, does that mean you put your dog in a crate before your company comes over? So it's about figuring out, well, how do we prevent the practice of the behavior, right? So It is a little bit complicated, but it's because we need to find what people can do, because sometimes it's hard.
Amazing. A lot of, average practice goes about 15 to 30 minutes of an appointment. And an overhead of a vet clinic, just break even, is about $3 a minute per doctor. That's just to cover your basic cost and have a 0% profit. And we'd love to live in a nonprofit organization, but it just doesn't work that way. So you think about how much it costs for a behavioralist to go for hours. That's to make the overhead work with all the expenses we have, it adds up. But wow, that's a pretty amazing amount of time. Jeez. Speaking of time, we're about out of time. If there's no other questions, we might just wrap this up and say thank you so much for this wonderful panel, for stepping in and helping us so much. Oh, wait, we do have one more question. Yes. Yes. Good.
And by the way, we've learned a lot by talking to you guys.
Yes, we have.
And we were all here to learn, so.
That's right.
Thank you.
You bet. You guys, thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you.